Good afternoon, everyone. Today's the 5th anniversary of the report by the Commission on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Individuals. It's a day that obviously is deeply troubling for many family members as well as survivors of those who have gone missing. I was able to meet with some earlier on today, and we were able to table the federal pathway this morning, and there's been a number of developments that have happened over the last year. But for today, I want to just express my deepest condolences to those members who of communities who haven't gone back. Express my solidarity with family members who are struggling for answers, seeking truth, seeking justice, seeking accountability. I've worked with survivors and family members in the past in the international context, and I know how deeply distressing it is. There are very few nights where families are able to go to bed not thinking about what they've lost. So today, I think, first and foremost, my thoughts and prayers and support and solidarity is with family members. Secondly, as we move forward on addressing the issues, the 231 calls to justice, we know that it will be a generational effort. It's not going to happen overnight, very similar to the 94 calls to action at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. There is work to do that will take sometimes generations, and in this regard, I think on a day like this, my role is to ensure that the government doubles down. Since 2015, since taking office, we brought forward the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. When the report was tabled 5 years ago, was given to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister committed to ensuring that we move forward on addressing those calls to justice. And today I can report that of the 215 that are in the purview of the federal government or shared responsibility with the federal government, roughly 107 have been advanced by us, which is solely in the federal jurisdiction or shared jurisdiction, and 53 more have been, which are broadly advanced, have been addressed by us. So we continue to work on roughly 2/3 of the calls to justice. There's still a lot more work to do, and that is the work that I'm tasked to do, and my commitment will be to continue on this path to ensure that all the calls to justice are addressed. Ultimately, I do fundamentally believe that this crisis can be brought to an end, but will take the concentrated efforts of all levels of government, the enormous work and continued leadership of civil society who've been in the forefront of the struggle, also the survivors and their family members who have been so heroic in bringing forward this message to all Canadians.
Minister, the Chief Woodhouse this morning at a press conference said there'd been little to no action. You've characterized it a little differently. Your government has been strong advocates of Indigenous reconciliation, but it seems, just looking at the numbers, 2 fully implemented calls to action out of over 200. What went sideways? What is the delay all about?
Look, I think there's a lot more than 2 that have been done. I mean, I will have to take issue with that particular number. I have a great deal of respect for the national chief. The work around the 231 calls to justice requires both the federal government, the provinces and territories, as well as civil society who have been working on this for many years. So of the 215 that directly deal with either sole jurisdiction of the federal government or shared jurisdiction, we have advanced roughly 160 of those calls to action, and we can go through them at some point if you wish. And those are very, very important aspects. There's still work to do, and there's no question. There's about 55 that we need to work on, but there's a number of areas that we have moved fast. Some of them will take systemic changes. So, for example, issues around corrections will require systemic changes. But we have had some very concrete examples of progress this year, including investments in housing, investments in transitional housing for people who are very vulnerable right now, women who are very vulnerable, as well as the piloting of the Red Dress Alert.
Sorry, is there In terms of the advancement, you mentioned the numbers are slightly different from what Chief Woodhouse gave, but she was describing 2 fully completed measures. You're describing advancement on 160, but how far advanced are those 160 less?
I think some of them are quite advanced, right? And I look at, something like the Kitami Truth Commission. It's something that was one of the calls to action that we were able to advance on. The former Minister Bennett made a formal apology. We have had 3 installments of redress payments that have been made, and I look forward to going there in the community to speak to survivors of the dog slaughter. This is one example where we have done substantially completed the work, but it's still not reflected as a complete task. So that is one of the one concrete example that we have for you.
Minister Brendan Hennigan, APTN, Fraser is asking, when are you going to appoint the Ombudsman to oversee progress of the calls to justice?
So we've received the report from the Special Representative last Friday, and I have had a chance to meet with the Special Representative on a number of occasions. She presented at the Federal Provincial Territorial, Indigenous Federal Provincial Territorial meeting in February, and it is work that we need to do. I think as part of the report is for our department to be able to consult with the Indigenous partners as well as survivors and others to see what the next steps ought to be. She provides a very comprehensive outlook for what the Ombudsperson, the work and the tasks that they need to undertake. But we're very confident that we will be able to move forward with the support and consultation of Indigenous
Just to follow up, do you have an exact date when the Ombudsman would be appointed, or when they would be, seated to their job?
The work is ongoing. So even before we received the report, we started the work on it. But I can't give you a specific timeline for that today.
So former interim National Chief Joanne Bernard said this morning that there is a lot of commitment for making these reports with the government, but there hasn't been a lot of commitment in regards to funding after they are implemented. Also looking at the budget this year, despite the 1.3 for the redressal, there was not any mention of funding for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So I'm just wondering, how does this reflect the government's efforts at prioritizing implementing all of these calls to action if there isn't the funding to back it up?
Well, the calls to justice is fairly broad. And when we look at the 231 calls to justice, they include issues such as housing, shelter, transitional housing, range of other supports, policing, changes to corrections. And if you look at the budget, although it doesn't specify that it is for MMIWG, there are some significant investments that are going towards issues like policing, as well as housing. We have, as per the Urban Rural Northern Housing in budget 2023, we have $4 billion. An additional $1 billion came in this year. So in terms of infrastructure, similarly, internet connectivity is one of those issues that are clearly identified as one of the calls. So again, we have investments that are bridging the gap. And look, some of these gaps will take more time than others. We just found out last week that in Northwest Territories, for example, the barges are not going to the northern parts of Northwest Territories because of the impacts of climate change. And there's some certain realities that we're working with, because there is a need to build housing in places like northern Northwest Territories and other places as well.
Right. And speaking of, you're talking about, some of these calls will require systemic changes. What do you think is required to make that systemic change?
It requires a whole of government effort. It also requires a whole of Canada effort. So it's not just on the federal government, although a lot of it does fall in our purview. A lot of it requires systems to reflect on their practices, and I would give you an example of correctional services as one concrete example. There's 8 calls to justice that are directly linked to correctional services, and I know Pam is here and Dan's here, and we've been working on this for many years. We have now an Indigenous deputy commissioner who was appointed, and that is a call that's been there for many years, and as part of their task is to be able to implement some systemic changes. But we know these institutions are are not easily transformed, because what took 154 years to build from a colonial perspective will not be done in 5 years. So the work, I think, really does require sustained effort that looks at systems. And when we look at the debate in there, right, for example, we worked on C5, which is changes to the mandatory minimum penalties. And if you look at the debate today, there's 3 questions on how MMPs, repealing the MMPs through C5 is bad for Canada, which is not the case, because the evidence is clear that mandatory minimum penalties impact Indigenous women, particularly Indigenous men, and young black men adversely compared to any other group. So we are also faced with some political realities where we're having to double down on our efforts to have change that are legislated, and therefore the work that lies ahead is quite large, and I think as a government today it's up to us to ensure that we double down and continue this effort.
Kind of going off of Joy's questions here, every report that has come out about your government's progress on First Nations issues, whether it's the Yellowhead report from December that found there were no calls to action completed, the Correctional Services report from earlier this year, and now the one from the AFN. At what point does your government sit back and say, what we're doing isn't working, we need major substantive changes if things aren't moving forward?
We challenge ourselves each and every day. And if you look at the issues that we're dealing with, none of them are easy. If it were easy and if it could be done, with a tick mark, they would have been done already. What is very important is that we have a longer-term vision of what needs to happen. And on issues of systemic change, we're dealing with institutions that are deeply embedded and in many cases with layers of complex institutional resistance to change. And when we talk about those institutions, part of it, the responsibility is with the House. And I think we've made some significant progress. But part of it is also the institutions that exist that are very resistant to change. So that is, I think, the work that really lies ahead for us. Look, there isn't a single day that passes where I don't believe that we're going on the right track. What frustrates me, and I'm sure it's frustrated everyone who's had my role, is the pace of this change. And as frustrating as it is, I fundamentally believe that this is a crisis that we can end. This is not something that we can continue for another generation. We know that there are many survivors that I met today, who are deeply impacted, who continue to live with the trauma. There's, 4 generations were impacted by the passing of just one woman who spoke today, Bridget. Her mom spoke today outside, and it really impacts communities in a deep way. So governments cannot ignore this, right? Governments need to continue the efforts, and I think as a government, we have made some significant strides. We have had unprecedented investments. We have repealed, for the first time in Canadian history, rolled back some of the mandatory minimum penalties for the first time, which we know is one of the most important things in terms of incarceration. But we still have a lot more work to do.
Last question.
You said that you don't want this to go on for another generation, but at this rate, it will be going on for another generation. There's families like you've spoken to today who are frustrated with inaction. What would you've spoken to them already, but what would you say to them who have been waiting years and years and years, have marched on the Hill, have spoken to their local politicians trying to get action on this? What would you say to them for all of this work that they've done, that there's been no progress?
What I would tell them is, in 2016, this government called for a national inquiry. In 2019, we received a report with some comprehensive, very broad stroke, as well as narrow calls to justice that in some cases are easy to fulfill. In other cases, will require transformative change. Every single year we are advancing. This is in fact the first year where we've had actual reporting and a deeper dive into what work we've completed so far, because it is a whole of government approach. And my message to them is that we will get there. We are so grateful for welcoming us into the spaces that are deeply personal and deeply challenging and hurtful. But we're not going to turn our backs on you. We will continue to work with survivors, with survivor groups, with survivor-centered, trauma-informed agencies that do incredible work on the ground. And ultimately, we will end this crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leah Gazan, and I'm the NDP Member of Parliament from Winnipeg Centre, and I'm joined today by my colleague Blake Desjardins from Edmonton Griesbach and my colleague Laurie Idlout from Nunavut. It's been 5 years since the release of the report from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. 5 years since the release of the report, and still there's been almost little to no action by the government. They've only completed 2 calls for justice. This is appalling. This is appalling because the Prime Minister called the current crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls an ongoing genocide. Yet, what do we see? Almost little to no action from this government. And although I know that auto theft is a critical issue in this country, this government committed 45 million to deal with auto theft and just over $1 million to search for our loved ones murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. This sends a very clear message that this country cares more about cars than it does about ending the ongoing genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals. This has to end, and we know that there are solutions. There are 231 calls for justice, 200 very clear calls for justice related to housing, related to policing, related to implementing a guaranteed livable basic income, as we see Call to Justice 4.5, something that I have based my current private member's bill to put in place a guaranteed livable basic income. We have the means in this country to end this violence. In the city that I live in, Winnipeg Centre, I live in the community where the loved ones that we're currently searching for in the landfill, families are now looking for in the landfill, loved ones where this could have been avoided had they had proper mental health care, had they had affordable housing with rent geared to income, had they had a guaranteed livable basic income. So I'm calling on the Liberal government to stop talking. They say a lot of nice things, but this is serious. People are losing their lives. Rates of gender-based violence are increasing under their watch, and they need to act now. Thank you.
Singh was up a little bit earlier. He highlighted the Red Dress Alert study in Manitoba. Your party has used their position in the supply and confidence agreement to get things done like pharmacare, dental care. Why don't you advocate more for Indigenous issues if you're saying it's a priority? Like, you have a little bit of a leg up in the government, I would say.
Well, I, along with advocates from across the country, with support of our leader and the NDP, pushed and was successful in getting a Red Dress Alert pilot program put in place in Manitoba. That was because of the work of myself, along with family and advocates, our leader and our party. If we had not pushed, and I know the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations has been very generous in acknowledging the work that I did along with the NDP to push and successfully see a pilot project implemented in Manitoba. We also pushed the government, along with the families and advocates, to get the resources needed to search the landfill in Winnipeg. But there's still more work to be done. This government is failing, and we are the only party that are holding the government to account, whether it's matters that are related to the confidence and supply agreement or matters outside of it.
Right, but what specifically are your conversations like with the Liberals? What are you pushing for specifically in the 231 calls to action?
Well, recently they've done some work on Call to Justice 1.7 to put in place an independent ombudsperson to oversee the implementation of the national inquiry. But let's be clear, I'm standing here with my good colleague, MP Desjardins and MP Idlout. We are the party that pushed for Indigenous by Indigenous housing. That was done by the work of the Indigenous caucus in the NDP. None of this would be happening right now if we weren't pushing this government. In fact, it is the NDP, whether it's matters that are related to the confidence supply or outside of the confidence supply, that are moving the agenda on Indigenous rights, human rights in this country.
Mr. Viersen, he made comments about voting against same-sex marriage and he remains staunchly anti-abortion.
Well, I think it's a matter for Pierre Poilievre to handle. When he speaks about defending of the rights of women, he has to defend the rights of women within his own Conservative caucus. This is obviously not what Canadians want to hear, and that's not what the federal government will want to do. We want to keep defending women's rights and the rights of people to live by and to love who they want to live. We are in 2024 in Canada. There's little appetite to going backwards in the 1950s and 1960s.
Et je pose la même en français aussi, s'il vous plaît.
Je pense que c'est un problème pour M. Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre doit commencer par défendre les droits des femmes au sein de son propre caucus. C'est le minimum. Il dit qu'il défend les droits des femmes. Il ne peut même pas le faire au sein de son propre caucus. Puis il doit aussi réaliser, comme la plupart des Canadiens, qu'en 2024, les Canadiens ont le droit d'aimer qui ils veulent, de la manière qu'ils le veulent. On ne peut pas retourner aux années 1950 et 1960. Là, on est vraiment rendu à un autre moment. Puis on espère que tous les Canadiens, y compris tous les députés conservateurs, vont faire valoir cette importance.
Merci bien,
Merci beaucoup.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah?
Who am I talking to? Where's the mic?
All of us. There. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's disgusting. I mean, this is the same Conservative MP who 2 weeks ago, along with other colleagues, wants to reopen the abortion debate in this country. I made a post yesterday because it was Pride Winnipeg, and I was proud to attend, that we can't take our rights for granted. This is why. Because we have prominent members of the opposition who are bringing us back in time, who are trampling over the rights of people in this country who have fought long and hard for them, who have won those battles, and despite the fact that those rights exist, continue to be marginalized in this country, and people like Mr. Viersen are going after them. So it's our responsibility as a government and the responsibility of Canadians across the country to push back against this type of vitriol, and I expect and I hope that it will not only be Mr. Poilievre that responds, that we will see Conservative members of Parliament from all across the country speak out vehemently against these remarks, condemn what Mr. Viersen has said, and reaffirm their support for the rights of same-sex couples in this country and reaffirm abortion rights in this country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What about Mr. Viersen's comments to Mr. Erskine Smith?
Well, I haven't had a chance to see the video, but I think it's telling. You know, there's things that you hear, and then there's things that you don't hear, and I think it just goes to show that some of those sentiments, the anti-choice sentiments of the Conservatives, are pretty widespread. So it's concerning. I think there's pretty well established, sentiment in Canada that we've moved past having this debate, but it sounds like it's still happening in the Conservative caucus.
Thanks for stopping. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Did you get a chance to see Mr. Viersen's comments to Mr. Erskine Smith's podcast? Any thoughts about that?
They're consistent. He said on the podcast what he has said since the day he was elected. So, again, no great surprise to me. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
I think the fact that the Conservatives are saying the quiet part out loud is pretty telling. You know, I'm a woman, and I have real concerns that a Pierre Poilievre government would try to restrict my access to reproductive health care and abortion rights and birth control. That's health care. I'm a woman. I have a daughter. I'll keep fighting for that.
Thank you for stopping.
La tragédie de Lac-Mégantic a vu 47 personnes perdre la vie, des familles brisées, une peine une douleur partagée par toute la nation québécoise. C'est pour ça que je suis surpris que Québec solidaire ait décidé de faire de la politique là-dessus. Le Québec a tenu 2 BAP, duquel émanent 130 recommandations qui sont suivies, qui sont respectées. On s'assure que l'eau soit protégée, que la faune, la flore soient protégées. Et là, il faut que cette voie de chemin de fer-là sorte du centre-ville. 47 personnes ont perdu la vie. Les survivants voient ce même long train contenant des wagons avec des produits dangereux passer jour après jour sur la même voie de chemin de fer qui a causé la tragédie il y a un peu plus de 10 ans. Ça doit cesser. Ce train-là doit sortir du centre-ville. Voilà.
Oui, de demander un 3e BAP, ce ne serait pas question. C'est hors de... C'est pas une possibilité.
Non, les devoirs ont été faits. Je suis moi-même allé rencontrer les autorités là-bas, la ville, ceux qui sont en faveur, qui est la très grande majorité des gens, ceux qui sont contre aussi, je comprends, leur doléance. J'ai rencontré les maires des villes à côté également. J'ai analysé les rapports du BAP. Les 2 rapports contiennent des recommandations, des choses dont on doit tenir compte. 130 recommandations, on en tient compte. Là, il est temps de bouger. Il est temps de bouger. Moi, je ne peux pas comprendre que plus de 10 ans après cette tragédie-là, ce même train passe à chaque jour avec des matières dangereuses en plein centre-ville de Lac-Mégantic. Je ne peux pas ni comprendre ni l'accepter.
La facture, le montant semble être mis en question, celui d'1 milliard. Est-ce que vous êtes en mesure de nous dire combien ça va coûter, vous, réellement, cette
Il n'y a pas de prix final, mais ce qui est clair, c'est qu'il n'y a aucun projet qui a été conçu avant la pandémie qui coûte la même chose après la pandémie. Il va y avoir une hausse des coûts. On travaille avec Québec main dans la main là-dessus, avec la municipalité de Lac-Mégantic également. Moi, j'ai eu des pourparlers avec le CP, j'ai eu des pourparlers avec, je dirais à peu près tout le monde. Pour le Québec, j'avais essentiellement 2 priorités lorsque je suis arrivé à transport. Lac-Mégantic et le pont de Québec. Le pont de Québec, on l'a réglé. Et je voudrais bien qu'on aille de l'avant avec Lac-Mégantic.
Merci bien.
Merci.
Today said he was concerned about the amount of criticism to the judiciary and the court reporting that it's becoming more inaccurate. He's concerned about those 2 factors. And as justice critic, I got to ask you, what do you think of the Chief Justice's comments at his annual press conference this morning?
I think always the decisions of the court have a major impact on all Canadians, and Canadians are rightly going to weigh in on what they see as outcomes that affect them, affect their families. So I'm not seeing that. I see Canadians comment on judicial decisions. They impact them. So I think it's expected. As long as it's an accurate accounting, it's expected.
I think perhaps one of his other questions was as the amount of media who are actually in courtrooms covering trials falls away, or and there's inconsistencies perhaps in reporting, that there may be concern about that. Do you have any thoughts on that matter?
Well, it's always good to see strong media coverage of decisions that impact Canadians' lives. Decisions coming from the Supreme Court of Canada have the same profound impact as what happens here on Parliament Hill. And there's a lot of media interest in what happens here, so ensuring that there's ample coverage there, that's important as well.
And as a New Brunswicker, any concerns about how New Brunswick courts are functioning whether it's being reflected by the Chief Justice or not?
Well, I think one of the major concerns we have is in vacancies in general in the judiciary. I mean, that is not the fault of judges when there's vacancies, and Canadians are seeing criminals walk free because of an inability to process the case in time, and that's a travesty. We're seeing Canadians that have been victimized, that are having cases thrown out just because the Liberal government has not filled a judicial vacancy. So we've been calling on them to fill those vacancies. That's going to help it's going to help the justice system. It's going to help Canadians, and it's going to help judges as well.
I really appreciate you stopping.
Could you tell us a little bit about your efforts to keep the man involved in the Humboldt Broncos crash here in Canada?
Yeah,
lend my voice to stand with Mr. Sidhu to remain here in Canada. It was a tragic accident that he was involved in, and pled guilty and served his time. And I know many Canadians across the country, particularly the families who lost loved ones, have been impacted. As a father of 3, it's unbearable to think of losing a child. This individual, Mr. Sidhu, is my constituent, and I've had the opportunity over the last several days to be able to meet with him, his wife, and his child, and he has asked for forgiveness. My concern with him being deported is also Mr. Sidhu been separated from his family, his wife who's a Canadian citizen, and his son who has significant health issues with a heart condition who requires care. And so I'm hoping that Canadians will also forgive him and let him be united with his family.
What will your effort look like? Like, what are you going to do to try and drum up the support?
Well, I've informed colleagues of mine that I'm going to be doing this, that I'm standing with Mr. Sidhu to support him, that we should forgive him. He's very remorseful, and this is deeply impacted him and his family as well, his wife and his child, and letting my colleagues know that I'm going to be standing up and speaking on his behalf and supporting him, and that I'm hoping to also be able to go into communities across the country and have this conversation.
I believe some families of the victims do not want him to stay in Canada. What would you say to them?
You know, I know how difficult it is. It's unbearable to think of losing a child. Mr. Sidhu has served his time and done everything after the tragic accident that he could do to be able to ask for forgiveness. And that's what I'm asking on his behalf as well. And I know it's hard to do with losing a loved one, but I believe that as a Canadian, he's served his time and he's asked for forgiveness, and at this point it's important that we are able to let him remain with his family.
Can we ask you what you think about Viersen's comments on abortion?
I'm not aware of the individual's comments.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
What are you hearing about what will happen in court about the boundary?
Well, I just know that the Court Challenges program is a very validating thing. When this community of Eskasoni said that this might be a breach of the charter and that they didn't have their constitutional rights taken into consideration, and the Court Challenges program has said that they've got a valid issue, that this could be something that we see go all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Do you think that can happen before next year?
I couldn't tell you. But if there's an outstanding matter that's before the courts, and if we get a judgment from the lower court saying that this electoral boundary map is unconstitutional, then I would imagine that the government would at least put a stay on the proceedings until such time where an adequate consultation process and an adequate process that follows the Constitution would move forward.
What do you think about Viersen's comments on abortion?
No, I don't know what Mr. Viersen said. I've heard Mr. Viersen say a lot of things in committee, but I'm not at liberty to share. A lot of it's done in camera, but yeah.
He says he's against it.
That doesn't surprise me at all about Mr. Viersen or a Conservative MP. To me, they seem a lot more like the Reform Party than the Progressive Conservatives that we once knew.